Good afternoon, and we want to welcome you to the session on a multi-tiered system of support, MTSS. Our hope today, based on this title, is that you are able to bring back to either your school or your district the ability to guide school leadership teams to establishing an equitable and inclusive system of support for all of our. So with me today, I'm honored to share in the work Angie Castor from the Swift Education Center, and I'm going to let Angie introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. My name is Angie Castor, as Jennifer said. I'm with the Swift Education Center of the University of Kansas. I have been doing this work, working with schools, districts, and State Department teams across the country for about the last 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was in a local school district here in the Kansas City area, working K through 12 as a school psychologist. So that's a little bit about me and my background.
My name is Jennifer Hoogerhide. I am currently the program manager for an integrated multi-tiered system of support with San Diego Unified, the second largest school district in California. I have been with the district for almost 24 years in a variety of roles. I've been a special education teacher, a special education administrator, and now this role as program manager, entering my third year. Angie and I have been working together closely over the last year with some funding from the U.S. Department of Education to bring about equity through an MTSS system. And so some of our work that's going to be presented here today will include the work that we've done with one of our school sites this year around building his team and utilizing data to support the equitable outcomes we want from our students. So no matter what role you hold in the education system, our learning intentions will hopefully assist you in understanding how the implementation of an equity-based multi-tiered system of support increases inclusive practices. We also hope that you walk away with an understanding of the importance of teaming structures and teams to not only be successful, but sustainable with the implementation. And finally, we want to guide you in how leadership teams can use data routines to inform planning of universal support across academics, behavior, and social emotion. So first, we would like to begin with some grounding definitions of both equity and a multi-tiered support so that we understand what we mean when we say equity and what we mean when we utilize the term MTSS. So the definition of equity that we have embraced this year, not only from Swift, but in our school district, is where each and every child or each and every student in a community is invited and welcomed into a system of teaching and learning that is fluid, responsive, dynamic, and alive, and that uses all available resources to meet student needs. So as you reflect on this question, or on this definition, I want you to keep two questions in mind. Number one, do you and your school system or your school site welcome students into your school? And are they invited? Secondly, do we give them what they need to flourish? So when we are implementing an equity-based multi-tiered system of support, in an ideal state, based on that definition, the system should be inviting. So thinking about who receives different invitations or maybe hasn't received invitations. We also want to think that our students are also welcome. Which students are vulnerable for not feeling welcomed or maybe not have a sense of belonging? So invited and welcomed are two different things. Oftentimes we invite into the system, but we may not have. And then finally, do we have a system of teaching and learning? And that really reflects on the piece around, are we fluid and responsive to student strengths? So now that we have a definition of equity, we should also define a multi-tiered system of support. I oftentimes think about this definition as my elevator speech when people ask me what my work is all about. It is a continuum of practices that are system-wide based on data designed to address the academic, behavior, and social emotional learning needs of all of our students. So this next slide you may be familiar with. This is the MTSS framework that was created by our colleagues at SWIFT and adopted by California back in 2016. It is broken down into 5 domains you see there, and under each domain there are 2 features, so for a total of 10 features. The middle domain is the multi-tiered system of support. This is the primary domain that includes academic instruction, behavioral, social, and social emotion instruction. And oftentimes I like to think of this as the house, where the MTSS domain is really the roof, and the other 4 domains are the supporting pillars to that roof. So without those supporting pillars, your roof might collapse. If we look at the administrative leadership domain, it includes the strong and engaged site leadership, as well as strong educator support. And this domain is what we have been focusing on with our grant, and it really is essential in ensuring that we can sustain implementation of it. And then the last domain I really want to speak to today is the integrated educational framework. It has the 2 features of a fully integrated organizational structure, as well as strong and positive school culture. And this domain really focuses on working collaboratively to break down our silos. So when we think about our teaming structures, we want to make sure that we are working across disciplines and really understanding that there is a need to collaborate and work together to make sure that all students are supported and make positive. So as we begin to think about the implementation of this framework, it's important to understand that this is an integrated approach. In our district, we actually added on the I to IMTSS because we really wanted to be explicit about our integrated approach. We want to think about integration in a way that is the whole system of, from the state level to the district level, the school level, even the student level, as well as integrated in the way that we address academic, behavior, and social emotional learning. So as this slide shows you the whole system engagement and support that it will give to produce sustainable results. Students and families are the purpose of our work. Schools have the most direct impact on students and families and where this place of transformation happens. The district is the point of intervention, and while the state is the point and the source of technical support. These slides, this graphic also was included in our SUMS grant, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. So I don't know how many of you were involved in the Scaling Up MTSS, but there is a link there to the California Department of Education. And our state created this grant so that school districts could work around the MTSS framework. And so our district was actually part of cohort 2 in region 9, and we were involved with Orange County Department of Ed, the San Diego County Department of Ed, as well as Swift Schools, in ensuring that we understood the why, the what, and the how. And so we were able to be a that SUMS grant, but there is a link there if you want to go and check out all the schools and districts that were involved with this SUMS grant.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that summary and connection to the California Scaling Up of MTSS. It's a really nice reminder for us. So as we think about the importance of an equity-based multi-tiered system of support, of course, we want to ask ourselves why. Why is this an important thing for us to work on implementation? And so we wanted to share with you about some of the work that the Swift Education Center has done and the research that we've been able to collect with that work. So what we've been able to do is really have a successful track record in helping schools and systems really transform their systems into having improved outcomes for students, excuse me. So we know that schools that have begun and have continued to implement this framework for a school-wide multi-tiered system of support, they've shown that they've improved academic and behavioral outcomes for all students. Schools implementing this equity-based multi-tiered system of support have reduced out-of-school suspension days per 100 students by 33%. In addition, with this framework and implementation, we've seen both English language arts and math scores improve for all student groups. And when we looked a little more closely and deeper to students receiving special education services, what we found is the proportion of students who are participating in general ed settings, 80% or more, that was increased. So the proportion increased from 81% to 83%. The proportion of students who were receiving instruction in more restrictive environments was reduced. And of those students who are or have been historically excluded from or have a significantly less time in general education, so students who receive services as having an intellectual disability or having autism or multiple disabilities, what we've seen for these students is they had greater percentages of students that were included, more so than prior to implementing this equity-based multi-tiered system. So what we have found with all of this work is really connecting to one of the key factors is having teams that work really efficiently and effectively to attend to implementation, to look at data across the school system, and to really be attending to evidence-based practice and building this multi-tiered system of support. So what I'd like you to do next is within our resources that are loaded into the conference platform, SCED, we have a reflection document there. So if you have that handy, pull that out. If not, just grab a piece of paper and jot down how you would answer these questions. So first, how many teams do you currently have at your site? Then list those teams. What are they? What are the names of those teams? Instructional leadership team, behavior team, social emotional learning team, whatever the team names are, list those as well. And then answer the question, do you use common agendas across your school site? Maybe that's in your particular building. If you are somebody who works at the district level, are there common agendas that are recommended or used across the system? So take a moment to jot down those few things. Next, I wanted to make these an explicit connection to how we see teams and the function of teams as an essential component within a multi-tiered system of support. So here, this graphic I like to refer to as our placemat, if you will, for a multi-tiered system. And what you can see there with the rectangular graphic is universal support is for all students. Additional support is for some students. And then we intensify universal and or additional for a few students. Across the middle, that diagonal in that graphic talks about the use of principles of universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, and that integration of content that Jennifer was talking about a few moments ago. But the importance of those three pieces are across the entire system, universal, additional, and intensifying that support, that those components are a piece of the entire system. So when we look to the bottom piece, we look at the key pieces that need to be in place, or what I like to call, we'll keep in line with Jennifer's analogy with the house, and thinking about these load-bearing walls, right? So in a house, we have to have those really essential pieces that keep our house from falling down. So the load-bearing walls in this multi-tiered system of support are having teams is one of them. And then the others there, you see data, evidence-based practice, as well as continuous improvement. But for our time today, we're going to keep our focus on our teams across the system and how teams use data. So let's unpack this a little further with looking at the teaming structures in our schools. And we're reminded with Elena Aguilar that teams are our systems. They allow us to work more effectively in achieving our aims. So one of the things that I really enjoy working with schools and districts is to really understand how our teams are working in our schools. How well are we doing what I call the verb of teams, teaming? So we'll talk about that a little bit more. First, I want to share some research with you. So this is some information to consider and look at. It's actually from the National Implementation Research Network, and really looking at how a team that's attending to implementation versus not. So on the left side, we have no implementation team. So we're just letting it happen. So here we're talking about an implementation team that's working on evidence-based practice implementation, getting it to a moderate rate of implementation, but that it took 17 years to accomplish that. So we can imagine across 17 years, likely the goal of students experiencing that evidence-based practice probably didn't happen, because in 17 years, they're out of our system. So on the right side, then, we go from letting it happen to making it happen. So an implementation team or a team that's attending to implementation of evidence-based practice, they're really making it happen. So what we see with this research is an increase in implementation. So 80% of sites were implementing with a high level of fidelity, and they were able to do it faster within 3 years' time instead of 17. So finally, children are experiencing the instruction and support that we intended. So that's a really significant gap that and draws for us the importance of having a team, an implementation team, or a team that their function is to attend to how well we're implementing those evidence-based practices. So on this next slide, I'm going to share with you Jennifer had shared that we have been working across 7 sites in San Diego, and this is sharing from Tim Swanico at Audubon K-8, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about his instructional leadership team, and I'll let him take it from here.
We are now bringing in more people to be part of this think tank. So we have now not only grade level representatives, we've got our math lab teacher, our counselor, our psychologist, an ed specialist, both for our mild mod and mod severe. And in reflection, our thoughts are then to now bring in the classified representative, SEA or SCT, our office staff representative, because finding someone in our classified staff who has a good connection with custodial, cafeteria, and all that are needed in order for us to really do wraparound services and supports for our students. And then most importantly, as I've even learned today from the presentation that Dr. Via and Dr. Thousands presented, are parents and family members that might be involved with the child or children that we are focusing or wrapping our efforts around to, because they know and they have those children and their own children, they have wonderful input to provide us. So that's kind of the shift we're moving into as far as the composition of our team, and trying to break from that traditional mold that's more just a routine and to say that we have it, into really making something that makes a difference.
So what Tim shared with us was really how important it is to look at the membership of his instructional leadership team and what they've been able to do over time to ensure that they've added additional stakeholders. The importance of doing the work of implementing a multi-tiered system of support really required that they have the right members of the team at the table, and that they were considering multiple stakeholders, multiple vantage points. So they were not only building new team members, they also know some additional team members that they'd like to add to the team. And then they actually took it a step further and renamed the team. So it went from the instructional leadership team to the integrated multi-tiered system of support team. So they're really intentionally working on that focus for their school system. And we thanked him for his allowing us to continue to tell the story of Audubon. So Jennifer, I'll pass it back to you to talk about more with teaming.
All right, thanks, Angie. Yeah, it's super exciting to hear Tim's work with his team. I know they're still working on adding on more team members, but it's very exciting to see the transformation that's happening at that school site. Next, we're going to focus on looking at teaming and communication structures. We want to think about what are some teaming, and Angie put it nicely, the verb, more of teaming structures, and then how do teams communicate, not only within their own team, but with all stakeholders across the school system. And so what we recognize is if that teams have consistent structures and consistent ways to communicate, they will tend to be more effective and efficient. So this definition is one that we've adopted in San Diego Unified, and we actually call our teams integrated teams, again, being explicit about that I and IMTSS. And so what we define them as is teams that include educators from across disciplines, parents and students working together to improve student outcomes. So when we think about educators, we don't only think about our general education staff, we also think about our education specialists, our counselors, our psychologists, our related service providers, and we also want to think about our parents and students and how are they part of the team, whether formally or informally. Can they give input directly or indirectly, possibly through surveys, but are they a part of those integrated teams? Some examples of teams that we see in our district that you probably see in your own are instructional leadership teams. We've developed culture teams that look at the behavior and social emotional piece of what's happening at schools. We also have our school site council and then our school governance teams, but there are a plethora of different teams that I know that you probably have at your own schools. And so making sure that we have those common structures and ways to communicate is really important as you begin to refine or develop. So knowing that you have teams at your current school site or at your district level, as you consider them, I want you to think about some of the common functions that any team should have at any stage. And so I want you to reflect on these common functions right now and think about, does your team assess and create a context for change? Is your team able to install and sustain the implementation of evidence-based practices? Is your team able to monitor the fidelity of the work? Do they plan and go about the action steps of what the team has decided? And do they solve problems using data, and are they building sustainability? So remembering what Angie said earlier, that teams are the foundation for implementation and sustainability of the work at the site. This slide is really key in thinking about your current teaming structures at your site. It's really the body of the work, it's the anatomy of the team. And it's broken down in 3 areas of focus for building a leadership team. First is the membership and capacity. And this really speaks to our definition of a team, that we have diverse knowledge, that we have people from across that have diverse knowledge in how to support specific students. Do team members have a variety of roles? Do we include parents and students as a voice in our membership? And then finally, they are the primary decision makers of the work. We need experts to know how to reach and teach students who especially are our most vulnerable, and how do we include them into our universal support. Second is the communication structures. Again, going back to how do you communicate with one another within the team? And then how are you communicating the work that you're doing within that team to the external? So who are we communicating to? What stakeholders? What is the way that we do communicate with them? And then finally, the third part of the anatomy really is the functioning and operations. And this really can be embedded if you have a common agenda. And we're going to speak to that a little bit later as we look at the work that Tim Swanico did at Audubon. But you know, teams need to have a clear purpose of what they're doing and why they're doing it. Do they have established norms that they revisit or refine as they go on throughout the year or the years? Do they have an understanding of the decisions they will or will not make? So for example, a PBIS team, are they going to be making decisions around academic support, or are they primarily going to be making decisions around behavior? And then next is a process for making decisions. This really was interesting for me because one of the schools that I was working with this year, they really wanted 100% consensus on decisions they were making, and it became really difficult. And so they made a process for decision making that they would only have 80% consensus, but that they agreed to work with the other 20% who may be close to consensus or buying into the decisions that the team is making. So if you have a process for decision making, it's going to make your team flow and work a little bit more efficiently rather than getting stuck in some decisions. And then finally, with functioning and operations, making sure that you have a way to monitor the fidelity or monitor the functioning of your team. If the work is intended to do what it's intended to do. If your work and your goals for that team are to only work on behavioral supports for students, how do you monitor that? How do you know that that team actually accomplished that? And now I'm going to hand it over to Angie, who's going to talk a little bit more about some teaming activities that you can do with your team to kind of get to see what you have on your site, to asset map the teams that you already have at your site.
Yeah, and you prompted my memory, Jennifer, as well, because as you were describing the functions and operations, I was reminding myself of our need to ensure that we're also being culturally sustaining there. So as we think about the diversity of our teams and ensuring shared voice and agency, that we need to consider different cultures and different ways of how the norms of a team or how we do teaming can come through in that process. So thank you for reminding me of that. So this team mapping, this idea, it's really an activity that we're going to describe for you. And it's something that, again, will be with our resources, but you can share back with your teams as a way to begin to understand how your teams function at your school site, or even at your district level, county office, whichever the structure may be, but how your teams function. So the first is to understand all the teams. So building upon those questions that we began with in terms of how many teams you have and what are the names of them, the idea here is we have a bunch of sticky notes. And for each sticky note, one team is listed. With that, we identify the name of that team and the purpose of that team. Why was that group formed? What are they to be doing? The function, what is the outcome or expected outcome of that team? When we think about identifying who benefits, so with those outcomes, who's benefiting from the decisions that are happening? Is it all students? Is it all adults? Is it the community? All, some, and few. So applying that idea of a multi-tiered system with also who benefits, and again, thinking the equity lens across our system. And then in addition, identifying the members of the team. So of course, this is a sticky note. It's short and small. So being succinct with our words, but you'll see in a moment, I'll share an example. So the idea here is we have the sticky notes and we place them on chart paper. Now, of course, we're in online learning. Obviously, we're doing this conference virtually. The way we could do this in a virtual setting is we can use something like Jamboard, the Google platform, or Padlet. whatever avenue you have that makes the most sense, I do think this is still really doable in a virtual setting. So as your teams are beginning to continue to work across the school year, keep that in mind as this activity. So this is what this might look like on a sticky note. So you can see we have several teams listed here: a leadership team, improvement team, behavior team, etc. We have the purpose and function for each team. You can see, again, it's very short and succinct. The leadership team is working on school-wide implementation, the goal with whole system improvement, and the target group. So we talked about who is this benefiting, all, some, or few, where that they've listed that's for all, as well as who's the team members are. And then across also on these notes, this team also noted the priority of this team. So I can see across all of these sticky notes, they're all at a high priority in terms of actions of this team. So what I'd like to draw your attention to is one of the things that's really important for us to be cognizant of is who are the members of our teams across teams. So if you do a quick scan of these sticky notes, we can see a couple of members, one in particular, Bill, who shows up on every team. So something for us to be thinking about is, do we have a member of our team on who's across multiple teams that we might be burning him out? So being considerate of how different colleagues are tapped, if you will, for their skill and their resource and what they bring to our greater school community, that we, again, being really cognizant about our efficiency and effectiveness, as well as the alignment to matching the skills for a different or specific team. So the next step of the team mapping process is that we look at drawing connecting lines between teams that have a similar purpose and function. Once we have those lines, we're going to place check marks on the line for those teams that have a communication structure. There's a loop between teams and it's formalized. So when we talk about a formalized structure or a formalized, in this case, communication loop, what we want to talk about there is that this is documented. It's written down. We all know what that loop is and how it happens. And the reason for formalizing processes is that we know as educators, there's a lot of change. We have new colleagues that enter into our schools and our systems. We have new leaders that enter in. When things become documented or formalized, those processes help to be sustained for beyond an individual person. So they're more systematized to help us do our work. So let's look at an example back with our stickies. So we can see here the lines of similarity. So we have some common purposes and function across several teams. And then we also can see with the red check marks that there is a formalized communication loop, for example, between the truancy team and the student success team. There's a formalized communication structure there. So why is this important? So this helps us to begin to consider where we might look at blending two groups. Maybe two teams are working on such similar content, or their purpose and function is so similar that we could really probably merge those two teams. So again, it's a way for us to visually see the complexity of the teams within our schools and how maybe we can do this work in a much smarter way. Again, to be efficient for the adults. And then I like to think of it in terms of being effective for our kids as well. So let's then think about how can we do some realignment? So again, looking at those commonalities across the purpose and function. And then we might also see, where do we have gaps in our teaming structures? Do we need to really attend to our communication, both within the team as well as outside of the team? That is often one that's a missing piece How do we share information across the teams and all the great things that teams are working on and solving problems and really coming to making decisions about how does that information shared and how is it formalized. At Audubon, again, back to Tim Swanico's school in San Diego, they really took this to heart. So they spent time identifying, as we were looking at prior, identifying the membership as well as the capacity of their team. So they knew who they had or they wanted to have. So general education teachers, education specialists, math lab teacher, counselor, psychologist, and the administrator. And they knew that they needed some additional voices. They wanted to look at adding the special education technician, a special education assistant, parents, and elementary school assistants. So we talked a little bit about that before with our earlier slides there. But then they also worked on their communication structures and functioning. So they identified how they communicate within the team, as well as how they share externally. So from their team meetings, what's important to take back to their professional learning communities? What's important to take back to different stakeholder groups? Excuse me. And then they worked on their functioning and operations. So they really intentionally broke each of these pieces down. And as Jennifer spoke to a little bit ago about that anatomy of the team, they looked at the anatomy of their integrated MTSS team and really spent time on these teaming structures and have really identified the importance of what this has brought their team together, gotten everyone on the same page and what their work is as a team. So one of the things that, as I mentioned before, that teams are really engaged in doing is looking at data. So I want to share with you a way to do that and the importance of using data to identify and work towards greater equity. We know that our systems in education, and we've all seen it particularly right now in a pandemic, that it hasn't been equitable. It's not equitable for many, many of our students. So how can we use data to work on our equity, to also bring in and include more and more students across our system, particularly in universal instruction where maybe they haven't been included prior? So again, I wanted to share and draw our attention to this multi-tiered system of support, this placemat, and again, referencing the load-bearing wall of data. So when we think of data at the universal level, some of those sources of data, and this is by no means everything that we have at our fingertips in our schools with relation to data sources, but at the universal level, we're talking about those outcome data. We're talking about universal screening. We're talking about fidelity data and fidelity data across the system. How we were speaking to earlier, how well are we doing or implementing the evidence-based practice we said we were going to? When we look at additional support, we're talking about the data that's related to how we make decisions, how we monitor progress, and again, fidelity data. You'll see that fidelity data across all levels of supports, and that really brings our attention to the importance of that. If fidelity data is not strong, what we know is students aren't receiving the support and the instruction the way we intended. So we can't possibly get the outcomes that the research is telling us that we should be getting if our fidelity data is not strong. So I want you to take a moment to think about what is your team's current level of data literacy. So if you were to jot down on your reflection sheet on a scale of 1 to 10, how strong is your data literacy? And what I mean by that is, does everyone have the same or a shared understanding of what the data means? Do we know how to interpret all of the data that's coming our way? And we know right now, or certainly across many years, that we have a lot of data sources. And often we don't always have a deep understanding of what the data always indicates to us. So it's really important that we understand the capacity of ourselves as well as our colleagues in interpreting data. So I like to really think about that in terms of data literacy. How well do we understand that piece? So when we think about teams using data routines, so introduction here into how we can use a routine around data to better understand and process around the different sources of data that we have. So first, we're going to apply this to our MTSS graphic. So when we think about the meetings, the many meetings that happen across any given school site, there's lots. And the first for us to consider is as a site level team, so maybe that's an instructional leadership team or leadership team of some sort, but what kinds of data sources are we looking at that can then support students across the entire system? So for example, we might look at the number of office discipline referrals, right? So that is going to provide us some information around if we have an issue within our hallways. Again, of course, this is if we're back, when we're back in person with one another, but there might be different ways for us to consider this in this online setting right now as well. When we think about universal support, the teaming structure there is grade levels, department teams, professional learning, and that they're looking at the data that is aligned to universal instruction. So how we look at those data sources to strengthen our core instruction. And the teams that we, are engaging for additional support are more of that expanded team. We might have some specialists that we invite. And again, we're matching our data to the resources. And here the data might be around some very specific skill needs. So we might say we have a need for vocabulary skill and instruction there for some students. And then for intensifying, we're looking at very specific student teams. So again, we're adding specialists to the team, and we're looking at how we can use data to intensify that universal and additional support. So what I'd like to share with you as you begin to create your own data routine, some important kind of key concepts, if you will, when we think about data. So we use data to answer questions. Oftentimes when we do that, we have more questions, and that's okay. That's a good thing, actually. So we want to continue to ask ourselves along the way so that we can make the best decisions possible. We also have to recognize that there's always error present in data. We're human beings and we're administering assessments, we're looking at data, we're going to make mistakes. The next part is regarding interpretation of data or making decisions. People make decisions about instruction, not the data. So I really like the phrase data informed rather than database, just because it adds in that human layer. Know your truth about what data to use and always ask the questions. Do we have a clear picture? Is this answering the question that we were intending to answer? And then we want to equity check it. We need to look at system-wide data. We also need to look at student group data. Do we has the data been disaggregated so we can ensure that we have a clear picture of all needs within our building? So the data routine that I wanted to share with you today is this idea around organizing, processing, and acting. So if you like acronyms, you can go with OPA. I've been calling it OPA. We'll see what sticks. So organizing your data, first, again, having questions to answer. And we want to encourage you to, as much as possible, have a visual display of the data. It helps us to do the next step, which is processing. So visual display of data around academic, so English language arts, math, behavior. I would add to that social emotional learning, attendance, and implementation. So organizing our data around those areas. Next, we would process around the data. So the first, when we look at universal support, what are the expectations in universal instruction? So when we look at the data, what do we see? Some of those questions there. What does it make me think? What are we doing really well? And what are some of the needs that the data is making us wonder about? And then we want to plan for acting on that data. So we want to make sure that when we think about what will work to acting on that data? What's the thing, if you will, that will have the highest impact? And can we do it? Is it manageable? And what supports do we need in order to make that plan happen? Very short and succinct: data routine, organize, process, and act. And Jennifer, I will pass it back to you to continue building upon that data routine.
So as you see here, the graphic again for MTSS is the layered continuum of support. So similarly to what our definition of MTSS is that we use data to inform our decisions. And so really thinking about universal support for all students. And so as we think about inclusive practices and access to universal support, it will be important for you to use data, particularly a universal screener, to determine the effectiveness of your universal instruction in academic behavior and social emotional learning. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about some questions that you can ask yourself as you're looking at universal instruction. So thinking about those categories that Angie spoke about, the capacity data as well is included in here. But first of all, what is the academic, behavior, and social emotional health of our students? What is the student data to us? Does our universal screener show that we have less than 80% of our students on track? And if so, then what do we do to respond to that? And then secondly, how are we doing the big ideas or competencies of this area of study? So when we think about academic instruction, how are we doing with Common Core statement? When we think about behavior intervention or behavior instruction, are we utilizing our PBIS? And as far as SEL, are we using the core competencies? So how are we doing with those ideas? And then last but not least is really around teacher capacity. Are we doing what we've agreed to be doing during our doing with our university support? And if our teachers don't have the capacity to instruct universally, or they need some support, what are we doing? And so the next slide really speaks to what Tim Swanico did at Audubon, that embeds some of everything we've talked about today. So this tool created common agendas across all of their teams. Their priorities for the year included looking at ensuring universal support both in academic English language arts and SEL. So if you look at this agenda, which is one of their 3rd and 4th grade PLCs, their professional learning, do we find evidence of data routines in the PLC? If we look closely, you'll see that they have a focus. Data should drive their instruction and decisions. And then they also broke it down into what assessments they were going to be looking at as far as both literacy and SEL. For literacy, they took the DRA, the Developmental Reading Assessment, which is a diagnostic assessment. They took the FastBridge and the DIBELS assessment, which are both universal screeners. And then for SEL, they really dove deep into the California Health Kids Survey, as well as their site-based surveys, their behavioral referrals and suspension data, and their attendance. And then they talked about what data is looked at and how often and what is prioritized. So you can see evidence of data routines in this agenda. And when you have a common agenda, you can build time for those data routines in. So again, Angie referenced the resource folder that we are going to be having available for you. And so as you reflect on everything we've talked about today, I want you to really think about these reflections for teams. First of all, is our universal support, our Tier 1 instruction, is it designed to include every student? So going back to that equity piece, are our students invited into universal support, and are they welcome? So are they a part of that universal, including those with the most significant needs? How are we giving them access? And oftentimes we can do that through differentiation, through accommodations and modifications, through universal design for learning. And then the next question really reflects on, if students are not having access to universal support, what might the team do to strengthen universal? Now, that might not mean we're doing something for the kids. That may mean that we as teachers might need to build our own capacity around how to differentiate, or bringing in other efforts to help us with that. Do we see evidence that universal support is having positive effect on most or all students? And that goes back to the universal screener that we talked about. And you can universal screen in all areas to determine the health not only of how our students are accessing, but the health of our school system itself. Because if we don't have 80% of our students accessing universal support, we've really got to take a look at what our universal support looks like, because we're not going to be able to intervene our way out of bad. And then finally, again, are we able to differentiate our instruction effectively within universal support in all three of those areas: academic, behavioral, social, emotional development? So this all really kind of wraps around to what we started the session with today, is looking at the equity piece. How do we ensure that we include all students? And remember that we talk about welcoming, inviting, and then having a fluid, responsive, and dynamic way of responding when kids are. And so we talked about teaming structures, talked about data routines for those teams to use, be fluid and responsive. And so our hope today is that you're going to bring back some of these things that you learned and develop and strengthen the teams that you already have at your school sites, and develop some commonalities and structures so that we can ensure that we are meeting the needs of each and within our districts. And finally, on the last slide is our email and contact information. We know there was a lot of information today, but we are so excited to continue this work with one another and to bring our learning to you. And I'm going to ask Angie if she has anything else to add on.
No, I don't believe I do. I'm so looking forward to seeing and attending to the chat box, and looking for your feedback.
So thank you. We appreciate you coming today. We hope that if you do have questions, you will feel free to reach out to us. And thank you for inviting us to present this year at the Inclusive Practices Conference.